Good evening, everybody. I'm Peggy Flynn. I'm the co-president of the Democratic Women's Club. Glad that everybody could join us this evening. And before we get started with our forum, I just want to have a few announcements. The first is that our next program on affordable housing is Saturday, May 21st at 10 a.m. And we'll be sending out press releases as we always do, and the information will be on the Democratic Women's Club site as well. The other is two things. You know, the leaked SCOTUS decision is on everybody's mind, and there are marches around the country this Saturday, but I did hear from Parenthood Marmonte right before we started that there will not be one here in Santa Cruz. They just weren't able to pull it together, maybe with the permits, but there is one in Monterey. I don't know where it is. The one in San Jose is Saturday at 11 a.m. at City Hall. And the other is related to that. You know, people are asking what they can do, especially folks like us who live in a, safe area. And Mike has put in the chat room how you can connect with Swing Left and Indivisible, in order to reach out to voters in more conservative areas in California and around the country. So check those out if you want to do that. So welcome again. Tonight, our delayed but much anticipated Forum on Water. We have Rosemary Menard, who's the water director for the city of Santa Cruz. Her expertise in strategic management, organizational development, team building, utility and operations analysis, and problem solving during 40 years of public service. Don't worry, Rosemary, I'm not going to read all of your CV, but I want people to have a little bit of background. Before joining us in the city of Santa Cruz, Rosemary held executive level water utility leadership roles in Seattle, Portland, and Washoe County in Nevada. And her strategic analysis, communication, and organizational development and negotiation skills have helped her develop and implement a diverse array of initiatives during her career. She's been with us in Santa Cruz since 2014, yes? Yeah, I think I had that right. So I'm going to let Rosemary just jump in, and I'll just say this as a preface. I was thinking today, who said water, water everywhere? I think that's Samuel Taylor Coleridge in that poem. But the question that we all have is there water everywhere for us? Right. People ask in the community, you hear people say, we're building and we intend to build more. And do we have water? Where's the water going to come from? And even with the UCSC growth, even if they have enough housing for students on the campus, where's that water going to come from? So, is there enough? Where does it come from? I think as lay people, those are common questions that we all ask. And luckily, Rosemary will answer those things for us. So I'll let you take it away.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. And I really appreciate this opportunity to talk to folks in this group. And I just want to say that as you go through the next several months, if you have groups that you feel like, would benefit from having a conversation, I'd be delighted to join any group and to provide, my perspective about where we are and where we're going. So I'm going to share my screen. I do have a presentation. I do want to say that I want to have lots of opportunity at the end for questions and answers. So I'm going to go through the presentation and then we'll get to the Q&A, okay? All right, so let's see, we're going to start here and we're going to go back up to the top. And we're going to share the screen, and I'm going to minimize you all so that I can see the screen. So tonight I really want to talk to you about the big focus for the water department this year, which is about securing our water future. We have been working over a long period of time on water supply projects here in Santa Cruz. Mike was part of a group that convened by the council just as I was arriving in Santa Cruz called the Water Supply Advisory Committee. We're going to talk more about their work and where we've been since that work occurred. But I want to sort of take a minute at the beginning of this to orient you to about who we are and what we do. We're basically a public health agency that provides safe and reliable drinking water. It's our job number one. It's the thing that is at the core of every single thing we do is this drinking water safety. And I think the pandemic has made it more clear than ever that it's a really, really critical function for our community to have available to us, and to have everyone to have access to, and for it to be reliable and there when we need it. This is a little bit about us at a glance, where we have about 98,000 people we serve. We do the utility billing and customer service for the city for all three of its utilities. We answer about 45,000 calls every single year. We average, actually it's a little bit lower than this number, about 45 gallons per person per day for residential use, which is one of the lowest in the state. We provide programs for education for particularly elementary age kids. We run a water system that has a replacement value of about $1 billion. It's got a lot of different moving parts in it, and many, many assets that are reached the edge of, the end of their useful life. And we're doing a lot of work at this time, working on rehabilitation, replacement, and climate adaptation. I'll be talking a little bit more about that as we go through the presentation. We're heavily regulated both by the state and the federal level, both for drinking water and all kinds of environmental regulations. And I think just for a public health and safety entity such as we are, knowing that we have 0 violations of drinking water standards year after year after year should be very reassuring to you. We're basically a major manufacturing entity that produces and delivers about 2.6 billion gallons of water a year to our customers. And we have a 0 defect standard. In other words, we can't let water go through that's going to make you sick or not going to meet those standards. So it's a pretty darn impressive accomplishment to do that day in and day out. We operate 24/7, 365. We have people working in our treatment plant on Christmas Day and Easter morning. These are our sources, which should be familiar to many of you. We have a number of flowing sources, North Coast streams that come from the 1890s, before the water rights law in the state. San Lorenzo River was developed as a source in the 1920s. We do have Loch Lomond Reservoir that came online in 1960. We're going to talk a lot more about reservoir storage as an issue for our community. And then we have a small groundwater system in the Live Oak area called the Belts Well Field that provides about 4% of our total supply, but it's also going to be potentially a bigger focus for supply in the future. So all of our water is local. Unlike so many other parts of California, we don't import water from the state water projects. We don't get water from the Sierras. If it snows in the Sierras, or if it doesn't snow in the Sierras, it's interesting, and it certainly creates an environment in a state as large and diverse as California that affects us, but it doesn't affect us directly in the way it does so many other residences and communities in the state of California. We're extremely vulnerable to local weather conditions, which can be both good and bad, in the sense that we're not affected by what's going on elsewhere. But if it doesn't rain here, particularly month in and month out over a very long period of time, and Loch Lomond doesn't get filled, then we're in trouble. And we get in trouble fast, but we can also get out of trouble fast when we get a couple of good rainstorms. Unlike much of the state this year, we're faring okay in 2022. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as I get into this as well. I do get questions about why no curtailment this year. And I think that I really want to talk to you about a number of factors that are influencing that decision not to have curtailment this year. Loch Lomond is about 90% full. I think I mentioned that a minute ago. When Loch Lomond is full or nearly full, as it is, we're pretty good for that year. Our problem is almost always not so much about running out of water this year, but what about next year? Should we have another dry year, and the year after that, et cetera? Our customer demand is very efficient. The use level now is about the same level as occurred during mandatory rationing that occurred in 2014 and 2015. And I'm going to show you a graph in a minute that demonstrates what's happened to our demand. So folks adopted and embraced a level of water use efficiency in 2014 and 2015. And when the drought was over, they didn't go back to their old habits. They've retained that those habits and those efficient use practices when it's been the wettest year on record, as was the case in 2017, or it's been a continuing dry conditions, as was the case last year. So curtailing under these circumstances doesn't produce for us a ton of additional demand reductions. And it does have a cost, and it is a cost to implement and a cost to our customers to, comply with. And so we're not inclined to do that kind of thing unless we're really in need. And that's why we did not implement curtailment this year. But our supply situation is such that curtailments are not a long-term solution to shortages we have. And that's what we're really focusing on this year is supply augmentation, adding additional supply that will help us deal with the problem we've had in our community with water supply reliability since literally after the 1976 and 1977 drought. I want to just show you a couple of things here about, we monitor rainfall and precipitation it locally and in the watersheds. We monitor stream flows. This is our rainfall as of the end of March. And you can see that we really had way higher than normal, which is the blue bars, rainfall in both October and in December. And then, of course, way lower than normal. Again, the blue bars and through the March, April kind of time frame, pretty darn dry right after the first of the year. But the good news was, because of the small size of our reservoir, particularly that last couple of weeks in December when we had so much precip, we really got a good head start on filling the reservoir. And over the months that followed, we were able to continue that even in spite of the fact that it wasn't raining, because the watershed land got saturated enough that it was continuing to put water into the reservoir even after it stopped raining. What the other thing we do is that every year in the spring, in the sort of late winter and the spring, we forecast what's going to happen to Loch Lomond storage based on our stream flow requirements that we release for fish, based on our need to meet customer demand. And what we concluded as a result of a pretty sophisticated model, taking a lot of different information into account, is that we would go from about 90% of reservoir storage in April to about 70% at the end of October on Halloween. And that, from my point of view, where we were at the beginning of the demand season in 2021, a year ago, was at about 74%. And we did okay. So I made the decision not to recommend that we implement, partly because we'll see what happens over the coming winter. But even if we don't get a winter that's really wet, then as long as we get a winter that's no worse than it was last year, then we're probably going to be fine, even with a 70% start. And we've got other supply development things going on that will help us with some other water that we can use to add to our situation. This is a chart I mentioned a little bit ago that looks at residential per capita consumption, the light blue bars. So you can see that before the 2014-2015 drought, we were running at about 50 or 60 gallons per person per day. So a typical household of 2 or 3 might use somewhere between 120 to about 200 gallons per household per day. Customers in 14 and 15 really took the request to conserve seriously. And once that drought was over, we've hovered there in the 45, 46, and now we're back to the 45 gallons per person per day in 2021. This is really, really efficient water use. I'm not saying that you don't have somebody on your street who doesn't occasionally water the sidewalk or, do something that you want to call us up about and sort of complain about. But fundamentally, our community has adopted and embraced this kind of water using practice that frankly makes it really hard for us to go and ask you to use less. And when we have to do that, we want to make sure that there's a really good reason. And further, when we have to do that, it is expensive. We do have to take action to enforce it. And it's not something that I want to take on those costs, which you bear, unless there's really a good reason. So I'm going to switch now over and talk about water and growth. I know that's a big issue in the community. I hear it myself. I was at the downtown plan expansion to the south of Laurel last month at the Kaiser Arena, and I had a lot of conversation with folks in that group about water and growth. So I totally get that this is on people's minds. And I want to say that just like you would do when you're going to invite a bunch of people over for Thanksgiving dinner and to stay through Christmas, you would make a plan so that you could accommodate that in your house, whether it's, buying more food, whether it's, getting those, the blankets down from the attic and making beds up in places, you would make a plan for it. And that's what we do as well. Not only do we do it because it's good, makes good sense, we're required to do it. So what we know from the work that we've done, I'm going to tell you more about it as we go through a few slides here, is that new construction that will be coming, we're pretty much a built out community, about 95% built out. So a lot of the construction, the new stuff that's coming is replacing something else. And typically when that happens, whatever it's going to replace is going to be more efficient in terms of water use than the previous use. And the other thing that's important to know is that we're using about the same amount of water now annually, despite the growth in population that it serves, as we did in about 1960. So we need supply because we don't have enough storage to get us through multi-year droughts. Our reservoir was sized based on weather patterns that don't really exist before, where in the history when they were trying to figure out how to build and how to size Loch Lomond Reservoir, they figured with the weather patterns of the first 50 years of the century that Loch Lomond Reservoir would fill based on precip 8 years out of 10. And I have been here now 9 winters. Loch Lomond has filled 3 times. Now it's come close to filling a few times, but it's only filled 3 times out of 9. So you can see that we're seeing a major shift, and our lack of ability to store water that carries us through multiple years because Loch Lomond is too small to do that is really an Achilles heel for our system. I want to talk about our water demand forecast and the way that we do it. We use a very sophisticated econometric model to do demand forecasting. It starts with assumptions about population that come from the Association of Monterey Bay Area governments that come out of the state. Those numbers come to the AMBAG, and AMBAG distributes them. And it goes from there to assumptions that are data-based about what's the average household size. From there, we have information about the average use per household, and we know the number of households that are coming, so we can get total residential demand for each forecast year going forward. And it does that for every customer class. I'm going to show you the chart in a minute that you'll see. So total residential demand for each forecast year, plus data-driven assumptions about non-residential demand, including businesses, UCSC's water demand associated with its LRDP, et cetera, accumulate into a demand forecast that looks like this. You can see the years across the top, the 2015, 2020, the actuals, and then you see the forecast years. This is 25 years out in the future. And there are backup charts that show that in the demand forecasting memo that show the number of households, the population served, the number of average per household, et cetera. You can see the number, how the projections are for the number of millions of gallons that would be used annually by each one of these sort of lines of on this chart. Businesses, industrial, we don't have a huge industrial base. Municipal, that's all the cities. Activities, irrigation, golf, coastal, this is the agriculture, coastal agriculture, and then the UCSC main campus you can see here. This totals, and I believe, there we go. What we've got is we've got a forecast that goes from about 2.6 billion gallons a year now to about 2.8 billion gallons a year, 200 million gallons additional per year in 2045, based on the growth estimates that were built into this forecast. This forecast is updated minimally every 5 years, and it will be updated relatively shortly because the county has been doing some work on their sustainability plan that you may be familiar with that is changing a little bit of some of the projections about housing units. But this is a relatively small increment of additional demand. There is a clearly that has some impact, but that's not really what's driving our need for new supply or how much new supply will be needing. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So here's the chart I mentioned earlier talking about the population growth, which is this yellow area, and then the total amount of water that's being used in the system. And you can see that the line up about, or back here where the yellow is, this is when we last used 2.6 billion gallons, which is sort of somewhere in the like 1966. The reason that that's possible is that in 1992, as one example, the National Plumbing Building Code standards were changed to require low volume fixtures. And there have been several cycles of that have occurred since this time. And also people in every utility all over the country, but certainly in the West, have been implementing conservation programs, long-term demand management programs, incentivizing people to, with money for rebates for washing machines and dishwashers. A lot of this has happened in a way that doesn't reduce the number of times people flush their toilet in a given day, but takes a lot of the water out of that process by using high efficiency toilets as an example. So it's a combination of behaviors. People have stopped brushing, leaving the water running while they're brushing their teeth. They've started to take shorter showers, and technology such as low flow shower heads and low flow toilets, low volume toilets that have resulted in this pattern of flattening out of water use that is evident all over the country and even elsewhere in the state. I've seen some pretty impressive details, even in places in Southern California where this kind of situation of flattening out of total water use and having the same amount of water serve a much larger population base has occurred. So the other thing I wanted to talk just a bit about, and again, to go back and talk about what's happening with who's using how much water. So you can see this is based on the difference between 2002 to 2004, which was the base year for the 2009 water shortage contingency plan, versus 2016, 2018, which was the year for the data that we used to update that plan in 2021. You can see that water use in these various sectors has changed pretty darn dramatically. Irrigation, 46% less water. Golf course irrigation, 32% less water. Residential, single family residential, 40% less water than 20 years ago, literally. And this is a huge change in what's occurred that has given us some flexibility as we haven't solved the major problem of supply, the supply reliability problem, because we haven't solved the fundamental lack of storage problem that is driving that problem. It's made the problem a little bit smaller, but it has not and will not and cannot make the problem go away. And so we're at the point now where we really need to add additional supply to the system in order to address the fundamental problem that we have in the system. And we need to do that even if we don't grow. And I'm going to talk a little bit now about the size of I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change and how that's influencing what the size of the solution has to be. Okay, so hopefully, oh, there we go.
Rosemary, we're not hearing the sound.
Oh, no. Hold on a second. You're not hearing it at all?
No, I would start again.
Okay,
and turn up
I'm
the
gonna
sound.
have to stop share and then I have to start share and then I have to do this. There we go. Okay. I'm sorry. Thank you for telling me, Mike. All right.
I like the pictures, but you weren't saying
I
anything.
know, nice, huh? Okay, let's start over.
There we go.
Anyone
Now
who's
we're-
lived in
now
Santa
we got it.
Cruz or anywhere in California for any length of time knows about droughts and wildfire. And we've come to understand that many of these events are made worse by climate change. It's fairly easy to understand how droughts and wildfire relate to climate change. Less rain means drier conditions, and drier conditions drive devastating wildfires, a situation that seems to get worse each year. It's also easy to see how drought and wildfire impact water supply in a place like Santa Cruz, where we rely completely on local rainfall for all of our drinking water supply. But there's another problem with climate change that seriously impacts our water system: too much rain. Our system was designed for the more normal weather patterns and rainfall events of the last century. It wasn't designed for the more extreme weather events that we're experiencing as a result of climate change. Our system is unable to treat the muddy, debris-filled water that comes with extreme rain events. Extreme rainfall also causes flooding and landslides, which break old and fragile pipelines. Our new reality is that we no longer have normal weather patterns in Santa Cruz. Extreme weather is our new normal. And our system was simply not designed for the new normal weather patterns that we're experiencing today. Climate change presents significant challenges for our system. The good news is we know what to do to ensure that whenever you turn on your faucet in the years ahead, high-quality water will be available to you. And the work is underway. We're replacing the oldest critical pipelines that are most vulnerable to cracks and breaks. We're replacing the pipelines, intake structures, and valves at Loch Lomond Reservoir, where we store the vast majority of our water, to ensure that we'll be able to fill and release water as efficiently as possible. We're replacing outdated equipment at the Graham Hill Water Treatment Plant to meet modern standards. We're testing new ways to store water, such as using underground space in depleted aquifers, which both increases our supply and replenishes the groundwater basin. We're revising the city's century-old water rights so that we have more flexibility in how we use and store water. And we're replacing broken and inefficient water meters with conservation-friendly meters that allow customers to monitor their water use. When it comes to planning for water supply to adapt to climate change, Santa Cruz is ahead of other communities. That makes sense because we have a long history of using water wisely, and we have some of the lowest water use in the state. At the City of Santa Cruz Water Department, we're making wise decisions and smart investments now to ensure the safety and reliability of our drinking water for decades to come. Please join us in these efforts by following the Water Department on social media, exploring our website, and engaging with us at our public meetings. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your patience, and I thank you for telling me that you didn't hear it. So I want to talk about variability, because really our problem is not growth or increased demand, it's supply variability. And this is a chart that I use to talk about that. You can see this is 100 years of data, and we divide the water years into this classification of wet, normal, dry and critically dry. And you can see that when Loch Lomond came online, which is right in here, if you look back to 50 years, a lot of this really nice light blue and the dark blue and relatively few of these yellows and reds. And if you look kind of in the last number of years since I've been here and a few years before that, you're seeing relatively fewer of these, the dark blue, and certainly way fewer of the light blue, and lots of this yellow and red color. This is the problem that I think is really the challenge for us, is that when we don't know if from one year to the next whether we're going to have, you know, a really bad year or only a slightly bad year, how are we going to size what the solution is, particularly in a situation like happened in the late 80s, where there were 4 critically dry years back to back here in our community. So fixing this problem so that we can get through in the event that we have 4 or 5 or 6 years of really dry conditions, even if we occasionally have a, you know, a little bit less bad situation, is what's going to drive the sizing of the supply solution that we have to develop. It's not going to be 200 million gallons of additional demand that is coming from the growth that's planned in our community. That's going to, among other things, bring us critically needed housing. So that's a really important takeaway from my my talk tonight for you. I want to just talk about just a couple of examples of this variability. I love this slide because this comes from this this group down in UC San Diego at Scripps called the Center for Western Weather and Water Extremes, which they call C3WE, I think. I call it the Center for Western Wacky Weather. And they do a lot of work on atmospheric rivers. This is a 2017 atmospheric rivers that hit the West Coast. And you can see there are 40, some of them, 45, I guess. And they're color coded in terms of how moderate and strong. You can sort of see the couple that hit us, the January, the February storms. This February storm, I think, was really one of the ones that hit us really hard and created the flooding that I'm going to show you in this next picture. This is a drought side of it. I'm sorry, I thought I moved this around. That's not in there. Anyway, so we have a lot of problems when we have this kind of weather situation where we have vulnerable pipelines that break. And so we can't use water out of the river, and simultaneously water is not available from Loch Lomond because the pipe between Loch Lomond and the Graham Hill Water Treatment Plant has been damaged by landslides. That happened 5 times in between January 9th and at the end of February of 2017. So you all didn't know it because when you got up in the morning, the toilet flushed and water came on so you could brush your teeth. But my crew and I were like every day wondering where the next drop of water was coming from because of the nature of that particular event. This was a most recent U.S. Drought Monitor. If you don't watch this, this is now pretty commonly available just because drought is such a heavily so prevalent around particularly in the West. Santa Cruz continues to be in this sort of moderate drought as opposed to last year where we were in this extreme drought situation in 2021. Our situation has improved because of those storms we got in December, even though that's a long time ago now. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit to close this out about the solutions and how we're going to get there and where we've been. So here are our friends from the 2014-2015 Water Supply Advisory Committee. This is a citizen-appointed group of folks that included whole diverse array of people and interests in our community and in water supply solutions. And they worked together for a year and a half, really hard. And they joke that they work for cake, but I think they worked for the love of the community a lot more. And the council asked them to do 3 things: define the problem, evaluate available alternatives, and make recommendations. And part of the challenge with the desalinization process that was being proposed, I don't think there was a good definition of what problem it was solving, and I think that was a big challenge. So this group did define the problem. This is the problem statement in sort of a short version. Limited storage. We want to meet fish flow requirements and prepare for potential climate change impacts, which could make surface water less available in some years. The gap was about, at that time, about estimated 3.2 billion gallons in demand was about 1.2 billion. So it's a lot. That's like a 40% shortage. Water conservation alone is not enough. This is a really concise and I think very easy to understand problem statement that I think has gone a long way in the last number of years of helping us talk to the community about what is it we're doing and why. In order to think about the alternatives, we did a somewhat unusual thing. We had a lot of, some of you who might have been here at the time of the desal controversy recognize there were a lot of solutions that were being thrown around. And so we invited everybody who wanted to come and do a science fair-like contribution to what was called the Water Supply Convention. This happened in October of 2014. And we had about, between what was here, about 50 different examples of things to another sort of 50 that were proposed. And every one of those got looked at by this group and evaluated to see what kind of, how feasible it was. And so there was a lot of work looking at those kind of supply alternatives. And ultimately, the group came up with this set of recommendations to the council: maximize long-term demand management, which we've sort of achieved way ahead of schedule. Use a sort of water transfers and water exchanges as a way to share available winter water with other districts. That's give them surface water in the winter, let them rest their wells kind of strategy. Store excess water in depleted aquifers. We can't do over here what they do over in Santa Clara, where you drive by the freeway and you see the big ponds. Those are infiltration basins that are putting water into their groundwater basins. We don't have that geology, so storing excess water in our aquifers requires injection. And there's, I think I have a picture of some of what's involved in doing that, and down a couple of slides out. Utilizes purified recycled water, and obviously Soquel Creek is involved in that, and utilize desalinated water. This was sort of the market basket, and we were asked to take a look at these projects all and kind of compare them on a apples to apples, or if not apples to apples, at least fruit to fruit kind of basis to make some recommendations to the council when that work was done. And we have been doing that work over the last, since 2016, basically. We've taken care of our water rights. We've been working on the system and taking care of a situation where we can do more treatment of highly turbid water that's in the wintertime. This is an example of some of the piping that's been put in place to test out the aquifer storage and recovery strategy in the Mid-County groundwater basin. And this year, we're finally ready to move to the point where we're going to develop policy recommendations to take to the council at the end of this year about supply, additional supply to solve the problem. We're working very extensively with our Water Commission as the main sort of public venue where this conversation is happening. And here you can see the Water Commission's planned meeting schedule between now and November, with specific actions being taken at every one of these meetings related to evaluating various kinds of opportunities, of supply opportunities, with a set of evaluation criteria that the Water Supply Advisory Committee sort of set up, and that's been augmented by some additional evaluation criteria. We've been having a really sophisticated water supply vulnerability analysis done, working with the University of Massachusetts, and it's going to be some fascinating results coming out of that, looking at the impacts of climate change, not just one or two scenarios, but 8,000 plausible climate change scenarios, which will challenge our system, and will show us information about what kinds of things, under what kinds of circumstances we would expect to be most vulnerable. And then developing policy recommendations and direction for or recommendations to the council will happen in the fall, and we hope to take this to the council in at the end of November of this year. So what we're really looking for from you and others in our community is to get involved with what we're doing. It's really important that our community understand what these what's going on with these activities, and to engage in understanding and being able to communicate, talk among yourself about it, ask for more information, ask for speakers for your group that you work with or participate in. We really need to come together at this time to solve a problem that's more than 50 years old in our community, and that really matters for the long-term future viability of our community. And with that, I'm really ready to take your questions. I'm going to stop.
Well, thank you very, very much, Rosemary. I feel like I learned a lot. I really did. I'm going to only speak for myself, but I see applause going there too. So Mike is watching chat to see if questions come up, but if people have questions, if you'd raise your hand and unmute yourself, I could recognize you and you could go ahead and talk to Mike. He's got your hand up.
I'll start with a question.
All right. Then I
So
see you, Sydney.
just to put a little more detail into Rosemary's description of the recommendations from the Water Supply Advisory Committee that the council adopted unanimously, it basically is a plan that says we have a plan A, which is to as much as possible rely upon water transfer, where, as you explained, we would inject water in years when there's more water in the San Lorenzo than either the fish or the community needs. We would ship that over to the Soquel Creek Water District, and also perhaps to our belt swells, I don't know, and inject that into that water basin, and then take it back out in the summer when we have droughts. That's plan A. But we also said, well, maybe plan A depends upon rainfall. If the San Lorenzo doesn't have years of excess water, then that plan doesn't work, or it doesn't work well enough to meet the demand that we're going to have. So there's the plan B, which was either to go to possibly recycled wastewater, or perhaps it's the third and last choice, back to a desal option if for some reason that turned out to be a better solution. We decided to put some money into developing the plan B, just because you don't want to wake up one morning and plan A's failed and you have to start thinking about what you're going to do for plan B. So my question is, how are we doing on plan A? I mean, in terms of getting ready to actually transfer water to the groundwater, to be able to withdraw it back out. I mean, is that plan working well, or or do we start to get nervous now that we should begin shifting towards wastewater recycling right now, or what's happening with that?
So the answer to your question is we have done some water transfers to the Soquel Creek Water District in 2020. I think that's the year that we did that. We were able to do kind of one whole season that year. We did a bunch of work in advance of that to ensure that surface water, groundwater compatibility was good, and that we wouldn't end up with red water or the Flint situation. So it was a very carefully developed program. The issue that we've had with that pilot is that we've had a number of years where unfortunately water simply hasn't been available to send to them. Okay, so that's one thing. Simultaneously with working on the transfers, we have also been working on pilot testing and developing and pilot testing aquifer storage and recovery, which is groundwater injection of treated drinking water into the aquifer in the Mid-County Basin, first using our Belts 12 well, and now currently using the Belts 8 well. This winter, we put, I think, more than 100 million gallons of water in the ground through this injection at the Belts 8 and Belts 12 in the Live Oak area. And this summer, we will be taking that water out and bringing that into the system for use. So what we've discovered in the Mid-County Basin is that process will work. We're waiting for the water rights changes that we're processing that are now at the State Water Resources Control Board for their action to get finalized so that we can get the groundwater storage supplement, underground storage supplement it's called, that would allow us to move that project out of demonstration and into actual ongoing implementation. So that's a process I think that really has demonstrated that at least we can start to implement and get some increment of supply from that, although it's not going to solve the whole problem.
Thanks.
Thank you. You know, Cindy had her hand up, but let me also say, I know a lot of folks don't have their video on. And if you still want to keep your video off and ask a question, just unmute yourself and I'll be able to see that and let you know that it's your turn. So Cindy, your hand was up.
First, thank you, Mike, for arranging this. Rosemary, this was fantastic. One of the best public presentations I have ever had the joy of watching. So thank you. My question, I know this won't solve everything, but I'm involved with a nonprofit and it's interested in adding recapture systems to water for the roof for casting, landscaping. And I wonder if there's any plans for a rebate system for residential customers, business customers, nonprofit customers to use these water recapture systems.
Yeah, so one thing I think that is really kind of a little bit unusual, well, two things that are unusual in our situation. One is we do have a Mediterranean climate. So we have the wet season and the dry season, although sometimes we don't really have even the wet season. But it means that, you know, the amount of water that can be captured is relatively limited, and kind of, I guess, how I look at it, which I know is not the popular view, is that the people who are doing this are basically off the system when there's water in the system. And then when there's no water in the system, then they come on the system. You know, see what I'm saying? It's kind of like a opposite of helping, because it really doesn't lower the amount of irrigation demand. It's maybe makes people feel good about recycling on their property. And you know, if people want to do it, that's fine. We're not, we used to have a rain barrel program and we're not going to fund that anymore because frankly, it's not a cost-effective thing to do in our system. And it does not make a very big difference in total demand that we have to meet. That's number one thing. The second thing I think really is that part of what goes through the system, and not so much in the irrigation part, we do have a lot of people talking about laundry to landscape kind of thing. But if that water doesn't ultimately go into the sewer, then it doesn't go to the wastewater plant, then it doesn't create the flow that can be used as an alternate supply. And it drives us over time potentially closer to having to use desal, because the wastewater, the volume of water that's available to meet our need out of the wastewater plant won't be adequate. It's a really complicated situation, but fundamentally, the centralized system exists. It needs to have the resources that people, you know, depend on it. And some of these ideas, which seem like they're really good ideas, are actually they're not bad, but they're not going to solve the problem.
Thank you. I see another hand up. I thought so. Laura Lee, you've got the floor. Or your
Got to
little
figure out how
box.
to unmute. Can you hear
There
me
you go.
fine?
Yep.
Thank you, Rosemary. This was very, very informative. And some of the questions that I sort of am going to the catastrophe end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
So I noticed the amount of water that UCSC would go from 100 and something to almost 300, I think.
Right.
And so I had a couple of questions. One is, how do they pay? How do they contribute to the infrastructure increase and pay actually their water bills? And then the second one is, what happens if we don't have the rainfall over 3 years and we watch the growth move forward? We don't have that backup supply yet, I guess, you know, so what do we do?
Yeah, so we're at the point where I guess what I would say is, I think the need to move forward with supply development is really urgent at this stage. And I think it's urgent because we've adopted such efficient behaviors that if I went and asked you all to cut back by 30%, it would not only impact residential customers, but it would impact our economy, because I would tell the hotels there and the restaurants and the other kinds of water using businesses, of which we don't have, huge numbers, but nevertheless, I would say you got to close rooms so that we won't. So this is not a situation. This is a 50-year problem in the making. And we're at the point where we've done, let's do conservation, let's have more efficient fixtures, and it's time, because the fundamental problem that underlies what's creating this unreliability for our system hasn't been solved. We have to solve this problem. So that's one thing. The other thing I want to say about UCSC is, so I'm not necessarily an expert on the LRDP, but in my understanding, they were talking
Let me
about
say that's the long range development plan that
sorry,
proposes to move UCSC from 19,000 to add another almost 10,000 additional students.
Yeah. But as my recollection is that it's got a recommendation for 3,000 housing units on the campus as part of what was used to develop that water demand increase. I think given the critical nature of housing in our community, it's really important that particularly if they're going to grow, and even if they're not going to grow for that matter, that more housing be available on the campus, which inevitably means more water supply. But it's in our demand forecast. That increase from 160 million gallons a year to 300 and something is in our, 292, I think it is. It's in our demand forecast, just like, the additional affordable housing is in our demand forecast, just like whatever else we would anticipate from the other sort of development and growth. So.
Can I have a follow on, Peggy?
Sure.
So you're right. Your words about, we really have to get on the supply side. Wouldn't it make sense to slow the demand side down until the supply side train is actually started?
The supply train is actually started. That's number one. But number two, I will tell you that if Loch Lomond is full next year because it rains, however much growth there is, fine. It's only when it doesn't rain. And that problem cannot be solved by stopping. I mean, a lot of people ask me this question, and what I say is we can't solve this problem by stopping demand. Because the problem exists for the people who are already here. And if we wanted to try to roll back the population served, we'd have to roll back pretty darn far to solve that problem. Moratoriums are not going to solve our problem. What's going to solve our problem is additional supply development. And, the half of that demand that is in there forecast over that 25-year period is not going to be until 10 or 15 more years out. We need the problem solved now.
Thank you.
We've got ways to do it.
Thank you. Any other questions, hands up or coming off?
I'll do another one.
Oh, Cindy, yeah, sure, go ahead.
If I can have another one, since no one else did. So large forest fires, what is that? How does that affect the demand? How is the water storage used for those?
It's not as significant. We did have during the CZU fire, they were doing a little dipping out of Loch Lomond, but not any. Think about it, it's big reservoir. So it's not a critical factor. I will tell you the more challenging issue about fires, from my point of view, is a watershed burnover. And if we lose the watershed, the vegetation in the watershed from a catastrophic fire, that's a pretty bad thing. But one of the big things that we're doing right now that gives us some flexibility is we're improving the water treatment capacity and capability, the process capacity of the Graham Hill Water Treatment Plant. And literally the work that's going on there is designing in additional adaptability and flexibility to deal with more impaired water that could come from a fire, as well as just winter storms, and increasing the total organic carbon that's already in the water naturally, that we're going to do a better job of removing so that there are fewer disinfection byproducts in the water. So it's a very comprehensive solution to a set of problems, but gives us a lot of adaptability to things that we don't control.
Thank you.
Another question.
So
too.
I'm going to jump in for a second, Mike.
No, let others go
Rosemary,
first.
this may seem like a crazy question, but you know what I was thinking? Now in the alleged dry season, my patio every morning, just like everybody else's, or depending where we live, is full of wet, right? Because of dew
Oh.
and then the fog rolling in.
Yeah.
Is there any way that's efficient as individuals to capture that water that, that maybe then I use for watering my garden? Or so is that too crazy?
There's been that discussion about fog, and what I understand from some of the climate change conversations that I've been around is that the expectation about fog in the marine environment that we exist in is going to change as well. There are things that you can do. There's systems that you can buy that will take humidity out of the air, but they're not scalable to the size that certainly on a sort of like a utility basis. But at the Water Supply Convention, there was a guy who was making water out of the air in the Civic Auditorium that day. And he had a little system that would produce, I don't know, 6 or 8 liters, I think, a day, maybe total. And they're great for a place like a sailboat where you're trying to, you're not going to carry a lot of water, but you need drinking water, and you can use some other stuff for washing dishes and maybe cooking. So anyway, it's not a scalable thing. Again, if you go back, and I'm sorry, I could pull back if you wanted to, the irrigation demand in our system is not zero, but it's not the driver that it used to be. That big change I showed you in residential demand, 40% less between 2002, 2004, and 16, 18, huge parts of that are irrigation demand reduction. Okay. So there's not as big a target as it used to be.
Thank you. I think we have time for just one more question.
Actually, Linda Wilson had a hand up.
Oh, did she? Great. Thank you for catching that. Linda, go right ahead.
Yeah, hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Hi, Rosemary. Nice to see
Linda.
you. Good presentation. I wonder if you could give us just a quick update about desalination and kind of what your thinking is currently about desalination.
Yeah. I had a couple of questions about this recently, and maybe this is a good place to sort of end a good ending note. The technology is certainly there, and we're seeing a lot about new changes in this technology that are evolving fairly rapidly, and perhaps not surprisingly when you see the situation. The regulatory environment, on the other hand, is kind of stuck in the Stone Ages. And tomorrow, I think the Coastal Commission is going to hear a case about the Huntington Beach desal project, which is a huge project like the big one in Carlsbad, the 50 million gallons a day, I think. Big project that's been supposedly on the books for a really long time. The Coastal Commission staff recommended to deny the project. I know the governor has recommended to approve the project. But the regulatory process for getting a desal project done, in my view, it's a huge barrier to saying, let's go down that path. We have some other things, whether it's this sort of aquifer storage and recovery in the Mid-County Basin, some kind of an expansion of the Pure Water SoCal project to look at potential indirect potable reuse in the Santa Margarita Basin. These are things that are feasible to get done in the kind of timeline that I think fits with what our needs and the urgency that we should be developing. I think desal will always be out there and potentially could be developed depending on what happens with climate change down the road. It's not the front runner from my point of view.
Can I ask one more question?
Yes, you may.
The desal project was a joint project between Soquel Creek Water District and the city of Santa Cruz. And the city of Santa Cruz, I'll have to say, being a member of the Santa Cruz city community, rather abruptly announced the end of that project. They were not happy, to put it mildly. They ended up with a SoCal, the Pure Water project that they're running now, and people know the streets in Santa Cruz are being dug up for that pipe that's
Yep.
started by our treatment plant and runs all the way back. We first of all take sewage from everywhere north of Watsonville, basically, or from Aptos north, and then we
Yeah.
shipping back water, treated water back, and they're going to treat it, when it gets down there. But my question is that how does that project relate to our ability
Yeah.
to take water back out, and to what extent are they reducing the amount of wastewater that we could use if we go to Plan B, because they're already using it for their purposes?
Yeah, so the pipeline, let me talk about capacities first. The amount that they're taking is 1,500 acre feet a year. I'm sorry, I can't convert those numbers well, I can, but let's just say the amount of wastewater that we have is that plus probably about 3 times more of that. So
It's not exhausting our
no, the pipeline capacity is 3,000 acre feet. So without doing anything, we could double the amount that's being produced. The treatment plant capacity that's being constructed at the Chanticleer plant at SoCal, the SoCal Avenue or Drive, I don't ever remember which one it is. It's on the south side of the freeway, and Chanticleer is 1,500 acre feet. So in order to expand that project, we would need to double its capacity, but there's room there to do it. So there's an opportunity. Thank you, Linda. There's an opportunity to work with SoCal, and there's been enough water under the bridge, and I think we've worked together enough to support what they're trying to do, that I think there is an opportunity for us to work with them on expanding that treatment plant and taking advantage of the excess capacity of the pipeline that's going in place now, which makes it more doable than having to start with a blank sheet of paper. The Santa Margarita groundwater basin is kind of a blank sheet of paper because they just finished their groundwater sustainability plan and figuring out how to get that water up there and where it's going to go and how it's going to fit into meeting their groundwater sustainability needs, plus making water available for Santa Cruz for drought supply is still a little squiffy around the edges. Let's put it that way.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any more hands, virtual or in real life, being raised? I don't see any. Oh, Madeline, I thought your hand was up. There you go.
You're muted still.
You're still muted. Can I unmute her?
No, she has to unmute herself.
Oh, that's right.
Okay.
There you go.
Thank you very much, Rosemary. And that's it's been very informative. That's a lovely view of the San Lorenzo and back of you too. Thank you for both.
Oh, great. Yeah.
This is Lee Abramson. I have one question if there's time.
Sure, go ahead.
Do we ever get more rainfall than we need in terms of storage? And what methods have you looked at for increasing storage on a grand scale, such as enlarging the reservoir, putting additional tanks in, perhaps underground storage in tunnels or caverns, something like that?
So there was a lot of work that was done during the Water Supply Advisory Committee process, looking at off-stream reservoirs and the possibility of increasing the reservoir. There was a bunch of work looking at storage in some of the quarries. Fundamentally, that all seems like a really good idea until you start to think about what's really involved, and then it gets to be a less good idea. Some of the places, tanks. And okay, let's talk about scale. That Loch Lomond is 2.8 billion gallons, 8,700 acre feet. And what we need is that again. So if you saw, I think there might have been a picture somewhere in that presentation of the kind of the size of Loch Lomond. And so really, some of the things that you're talking about don't have anywhere near the capacity to make a difference. It's not feasible to raise the dam at Loch Lomond, Mill Creek Dam. That's not a feasible thing. The site, and for a couple of reasons. One, I think it's a sort of earthquake issues. Not that the dam is sort of subject to earthquake, but the more you build it, the more that you create some opportunities for problems. But the other thing is that's a really small drainage basin, and so you're filling it with the land around it, literally shedding water into that reservoir is how it gets filled. And if you make the reservoir too big, then it doesn't fill because there's not enough land to send the water to. This is the idea behind the Felton diversion. And Mike probably knows or maybe remembers that the Felton diversion was developed. It's a pumping facility on the river, on the San Lorenzo River below Felton, that was designed to take water out of the river because Loch Lomond is way at the top of one particular watershed, and there's a bigger watershed that's draining water. Anyway, take water from the river at Felton and send it back up the pipeline and put it into Loch Lomond Reservoir and also Zayani Reservoir, which never got built. Felton diversion was used this year to put 5 feet of water in Loch Lomond. But in a lot of cases, and in many cases, when there's years when there's tons of water that could be put there, Loch Lomond is already full.
I also would add, I was on the council when this happened. We talked about raising the dam and the sides of Loch Lomond to capture more water. And the regulatory agencies told us they would require us to release so much more water that we would lose water capacity for customers if we did that. So it might be technically feasible, but it's not regulatorily feasible.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I just want to remind everybody to tell your friends who weren't here. I just saw a message in chat asking if we were recording it, and we are. And lots of people get to see these because, maybe in a couple of days it'll be on our website. So if there aren't any more questions, I want to thank you again, Rosemary. I feel like I was in a secret club this evening, getting all this information, and I'm glad people could come, and I wish more could come, but they'll be able to see our recording. So if there's not any last minute burning desire, I think we'll close it off.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and please feel free to let me know if you'd like me to come back another time.
I'm sure this issue will not go away, I bet.
No, and we got a lot going on in the next few months, so it'd be great to come back at sometime in the late summer maybe and talk about the work we've been doing, looking at the options. And
Please.
Yes, right.
Great.
Okay, well, what a round
Thanks
of
so much.
applause. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and thank you for being with us.
Okay, great. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. I'm going to end the forum.
Thanks,
Oh.
Mike. Whoop.